Hello, everyone. This is session 3.1, the Spark session at Heritage and the Global Reset, the National Trust and CAP Conference. This session is sponsored by Robertson Martin Architecture, and they're based in Ottawa, and we're grateful for them for their support for this particular session. And it's going to be a very exciting one. But first of all, I'd like to jump into acknowledge the fact that this session is taking place virtually on the Indigenous territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people here in Ottawa. And we recognize that conference participants live and work on many lands of Indigenous peoples across Canada, and we encourage you to join us in reflecting upon the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, past and present. So this is one of the points at the conference, which is quite bombastic and very energized, the Spark session. And because it's usually a very fast and furious, it's still going to be fast, a little less furious because we're not going to be there in the flesh together. We usually cluster them into small groups and then have very compact and bombastic Q&A sessions after each little cluster of presentations. Today, we're going to run them straight through just for ease of technical fluidity, but I think we can still have a very dynamic and fulsome exchange at the end of this session. So I'm going to run. Hopefully you can also, it's a little bit of a brain teaser for audience members to try to keep in mind all of the different presentations that you're going to hear, 7 or 8 of them during this session, to keep in mind questions that you may have from each presentation. Please put them in the chat. And I'll, one of my colleagues will pass them along to me, and so that you can keep all of those questions straight and in our minds, and I can ask them at the end of the session. So introducing all of our presenters in a row. Try to remember these as a little skill testing question later. First off will be Hunter Cardinal, and he's out of Edmonton, and he's going to be talking about Indigenous concepts of place. Then we're going to have Sahra Campbell, and she's with Campbell Conservation, and she is a University of Lincoln student, and she's going to be talking about problematic monuments. Then Leanna Wigboldus, and she's here in Ottawa presently, though she studies in Dublin, and she's going to be looking at cultural landscape continuity. Then we're going to toss it over to the other side of Canada, to Gerald Carreau in Calgary, who's going to talk about historic window conservation. And then we're going to pass it on, again, a new concept yet again, to Robin Hoytema, and she is over at Robertson Martin Architecture here in Ottawa, and she's going to be talking about worship, from worship to wellness, reimagining post-pandemic places of worship. Fascinating topic. Then we're going to move over back to Calgary again, and have Karen Paul and Tara Drevitt, and they're going to talk about Heritage YYC in Calgary, which is inspiring real estate agents and the entire community, honestly. So at that point, then we'll open it up for a question and answer, and then we'll take it from there. But looking forward to it, and so I'll let you watch the presentations in the recording that follows. Thanks so much, everyone. See you in a bit.
Tanse everyone, hello, my name is Hunter Cardinal, and I walk with the stories and teachings of my people that mostly find their roots here in Treaty 8 territory in Canada, though we are spread across several numbered treaty territories. And today I make my home on this beautiful Treaty 6 territory here in Edmonton, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta's Region 4. First, I want to thank you all for inviting me to this gathering today. It's my hope that I can offer some value to you to help with the important work that you're all doing for the places that we live. A bit about me before I dive into what I'm here to speak about. My background is in acting and performance, and my main passion in life is connecting people with the larger, very exciting stories that they're a part of so that they can feel rooted during turbulent times, kind of like the ones that we're in right now. I'm also director of story and half of the sibling team behind Naheyawin, which is a social enterprise that offers sustainable, practical, and Indigenous-based solutions for the improvement of diversity and inclusion in businesses and organizations across Turtle Island. We do this with a storytelling and education approach that's informed by a treaty lens, or what it is to be in relationship from an Indigenous perspective. If I had to boil down all of the work that we do at Naheyawin, it's that we walk alongside groups as they navigate back into what my people, the Naheyawak, refer to as the great circle of being in the world. A circle where we each have a place and are connected to one another, not just as humans, but as the animals, the plants, and the lands, and the cosmos that we are connected to as well. Because many of us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, are lost. We have forgotten this great circle, this grand story. And the story that we have instead, that we are inherently separate from one another, stratified from nature, and the pinnacle of human progress, that keeps us in a space of scarcity and competition that limits how we think and the tools that we can draw from. What I've been taught is that reminding ourselves of this story and finding our place within it isn't the only great challenge of our lives in this time, but it is the ultimate challenge. It is the work of life. Our most sacred ceremonies, teachings, and ways of being are all geared towards trying to answer this question of how we find and continually create balance in ourselves and all those that we are in relationship with. What I want to share with you and challenge you to think about as you continue to do the work that you do is about the basis from which we are all connected, which is the land, or this place. So from an Indigenous perspective, we live among layers of history and human connections that make up our sense of place. Just as we're simultaneously on Treaty 6 territory here in Edmonton, so are we on the lands of the Métis Nation of Alberta's Region 4, as well as the many other traditional names that have storied this place since time immemorial, such as for the Naheyawak or Cree people, we called this place a pehonan, a waiting place, a gathering place. And then later with the fur trade, it became a Miskochi Waskihagan, which means Beaver Hills House. And for the Dene, another Indigenous group, they called this place Sayotekoi, which also means Beaver Hills House. Now for the Blackfoot or Nitsitapi, they called this place Omokoyes, which means Big House. And for the Nakota Sioux, they called it Tatunga, which also means big house. As well as some of you may know, here in Edmonton, we have new ward names that are from Indigenous languages and hint at still more layers. So the reason this is valuable is because from this perspective, why it's useful to look at this place in this way as a many-layered dynamic concept that is all about making meaning and relationships is because a new perspective becomes possible. And it's not just that we are heirs to an immense and complex fortune, but that we are collaborating as future ancestors on creating new layers of place. We are responsible for not just conserving the land and our stories, but for creating new stories and preparing good relationships for those who will soon be arriving as well. So, in approaching your work, this small part of our return back to this great circle, I want to challenge you to remember that we are all wrapped in this land and its many layers of place, tangled within them with all who call this place home, becoming, as Martin Prachtel describes, as deliciously confused, dedicated to making the earth flower in a bigger plan of spirit beyond our mind and understandings. Asking yourself questions like, how are we taking care of the layers of place that surround us? Not just the humans, but our non-human relations as well, the plants, the animals. How are we regularly deepening our understandings of these layers? Are we learning about the many stories of the places that we live, work, and grow together? How are we empowering communities to create new layers? And what are the layers that no longer resonate? And where we find those layers, how should we approach overlaying new meaning there? How might we meaningfully engage with these layers in the many aspects of the work that we do? Land acknowledgements here in Canada are critical, but what else? How can we remind ourselves of our connection to place and people through time? And the trickiest one is, how are we weaving together these many layers? So thank you so much once again for inviting me to share some knowledge today. Hi, Kananaskamatan. Thank you.
Hi, and thank you for having me. To begin, I'd like to look at a specific monument as a point of focus for the broader conversation around problematic built heritage. To be clear, this is just one of many uncomfortable monuments in our civic spaces that we need to contend with. And my hope is that by understanding how and why its interpretation has shifted over time, we can begin to examine how we in the heritage field can advocate for evolving value systems and cultural identity. This particular Champlain Monument is in Orillia, Ontario, and also the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee. It was made by Vernon March, the English sculptor who also created the National War Memorial in Ottawa. So here we have it. It's a 12-foot bronze sculpture of Champlain, flanked on either side by two figures representing Christianity and commerce. To the right, a Jesuit priest wields his cross above two Huron-Wendat men sitting at his feet, and to the left, a French coureur de bois barters with two more Huron-Wendat men at his feet. According to the plaque, the monument was created in praise of the great explorer who heralded the advent of white civilization in Ontario, and also for the promotion of good relations between Ontario and Quebec. At the time of its conception, French-English tensions within Canada were high due to the 1917 introduction of mandatory conscription, which divided English Canadians, who generally supported fighting in the name of the British Empire, and French Canadians, who generally did not. This is useful for understanding the motives behind the Champlain Monument. The souvenir publication honors the French and British settlers who lived and died for the cause of Christianity and civilization, subdued the wilderness before them, and built temples to the true God where formerly had ascended the smoke of idolatrous sacrifices. The monument was removed for restoration in 2017 by Parks Canada. When this announcement was made, social justice movements were gaining momentum around the world. Within Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was well underway. In the US, the white supremacist rallies in Charlottesville and the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery ignited fierce protests for racial justice and intensified the debates around representations of race and power in civic space. In the UK, demonstrations against monuments dedicated to contentious historic figures led to the toppling of the statue of slave trader Edward Colston in Bristol. And in more recent news, the spotlight's again been shone on Canada with the heartbreaking discovery this summer of hundreds of unmarked graves of Indigenous children at residential school sites across the country. The shift in sentiment regarding the Champlain Monument and others like it is palpable as calls grow for the removal of controversial monuments that many believe serve to lionize colonialism and undermine Indigenous heritage. And this is not unfounded. Many of the monuments in present-day Canadian cities originate from an intense period of monument building that took place around the turn of the century. Canada was following a similar trend that's been documented in 19th century Britain, Europe, and the United States, when ideas of heritage were rooted in deliberations around nationalism, social identity, racial order, and modernity. Monuments were very effective in bolstering official narratives. By immortalizing people and events, they recreated a patriotic history that was in line with the ideologies of national institutions. They were essentially political tools for directing the public to embrace common civic values and traditions. The portrayal of the Huron-Wendat in the Champlain Monument is entirely a reflection of prevailing Eurocentric racist attitudes than of any real historic event. When it was commissioned in 1913, First Nations people had few rights to speak of under Canadian law. The monument tells a deliberately false narrative for the benefit of English and French Canadian patriotism, while marginalizing the contributions of the Huron-Wendat. Champlain's legacy, Christianity, and settler history are meaningful for many Canadians, and these are certainly values worthy of preservation. But this monument, both in design and intent, expresses blatant ignorance and ideas of white supremacy, which have no place in democratic society today. I think for those of us in the field who deal with the conservation of historic sites and monuments, it's really important that we strive to fully understand their true history and intent. We need to recognize that we can't be passive as advocates for the preservation of cultural property, because by deciding which physical interventions are suitable, we are making decisions about what we consider to have material value and what the future of an object or a place will be. I do believe the conservation field is stepping up and acknowledging that we have this responsibility to society. Over the last couple of years, the American National Trust for Preservation, the American Institute for Conservation, and the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals have all released statements supporting a community consensus approach in developing treatment considerations for contested monuments. Other organizations, such as the National Trust for Canada, are having these conversations in the form of symposiums and public discussions. Parks Canada recently introduced the Framework for History and Commemoration, outlining their approach to sharing Canada's history through diverse and sometimes complex perspectives. They've also set up a webpage to invite the public to submit requests for designation reviews. So we're moving in the right direction, but as CAP humbly acknowledged in a letter sent to members this year, much work is left to be done before we can say we live in an equal society. As a conservation practitioner myself, I believe that we can support democratic approaches to heritage by renouncing outmoded ideas, favoring obsolete agendas that don't align with a modern, inclusive society. There are many ways to interpret a site, and there's no one-size-fits-all approach, so I certainly don't profess to know any or all of the answers. But I think a good starting point is to be in tune with the discourse and to be empathetic in our treatment approaches. Unlike other forms of cultural expression, monuments are unique in that they exclusively occupy public spaces, and therefore they play an important role in communicating collective history and ideals. Their alteration or removal presents a unique opportunity for thoughtful reconsideration of the stories we want to tell. This is a moment for us to take real pause and ask ourselves about what we, as a society, and as conservation professionals, should value, and what this means for the future of our public spaces. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Leanna Wigboldus, and I am currently a PhD candidate at University College Dublin in World Heritage. My presentation is entitled Moving Forward by Looking Back, Integrated Approaches for Cultural Landscape Continuity. In heritage studies today, there is often a focus on forward-thinking approaches to addressing challenges and opportunities such as advanced technologies, digital apps and monitoring, climate change adaptations, and, more recently, challenges resulting from COVID-19. While this approach is certainly beneficial, it is important to look back and consider the technologies and knowledges that came before, particularly for heritage landscapes where natural and cultural values are understood to be intrinsically and intricately connected. So why is it important to look back with respect to continuing landscapes? One, cultural landscapes have, in many cases, existed for thousands of years under the stewardship and management of local and Indigenous people. Two, they are often related to a set of historic knowledges, practices, or traditions that protect not only the natural heritage of the area, but the cultural heritage as well. And three, they are often important to biodiversity, habitat and ecosystem protection, and sustainable strategies. Such past expertise, knowledges, adaptations, and changes have contributed to the resilience and sustainability of these landscapes. This is particularly important for agricultural and pastoral landscapes, where generations of use and maintenance have helped to maintain food security, ensure species biodiversity, and support local economic livelihoods. My current research involves international case studies of agricultural and pastoral landscapes, which are also World Heritage Sites. These sites often have strict management practices in place for heritage and therefore provide global examples of best practice. They can contribute to the understanding and management of our own local and national sites and provide new perspectives on topics such as climate change, management practices, local governance, and sustainability. In my case study analysis, 3 elements which come to the forefront as essential for successful conservation and management practices are: 1, the importance of combining traditional and scientific knowledge sources; 2, the use of inter and multidisciplinary stakeholders in management practices; and 3, a holistic approach to understanding and managing landscapes. My 2 case studies are the English Lake District, a pastoral landscape in England, and the agricultural landscape of southern Öland, an agricultural island in southern Sweden. These case studies identify how each landscape addresses the 3 topics I outlined above. 1, the importance of combining traditional and scientific knowledge sources. In the Lake District, farms, farmers, and sheep play very important roles in the management of local environments and maintenance of biodiversity. With limited academic educational opportunities, local knowledges and practices are transferred orally within families and communities. This traditional expertise of local farmers, however, is often in conflict with the perceived scientific knowledge of conservation agencies. An example of this is in rewilding programs, where nature conservation authorities attempt to regulate and restrict the farmers' use of the land, even though farmers have maintained the same area sustainably for hundreds of years. In southern Öland, many of the pastoral practices have been maintained through the use of EU subsidies. It has been recognized nationally and internationally that farmers and cattle are essential for maintaining biodiversity and endemic species and habitats in the landscape. Through the use of EU subsidies, people are compensated for providing the traditional herding and pastoral practices and land use, as well as for maintaining and clearing the area of invasive species. While both sites indicate the importance of using both scientific and traditional knowledges, the EU subsidies which support the Öland traditional farming practices allow for a more integrated approach to natural and cultural conservation than in the Lake District, where attention between traditional farmers and scientific conservation authorities requires more creative collaboration. 2, the use of inter and multidisciplinary stakeholders in management practices. In the Lake District, the management group they have created is called a partnership, part of a partnership program, which is a collection of 25 stakeholders, all of whom have a role in the management of the World Heritage Site and the National Park landscape. The program includes a partnership plan for management, quarterly meetings, and subcommittees to deal with specific elements like sustainable development and transportation. Although the site is only 2 years old, it is already apparent how this type of structure, although challenging to organize, can result in clear, straightforward management and can be useful for future partnerships and collaboration. Öland is often regarded as a very successful site for local participation and management, where the local parishes spearheaded the nomination process for its inscription as a World Heritage Site. The World Heritage Management Group, although much smaller than the Lake District Partnership, supports collaboration between natural and cultural heritage groups, farmers, and other local stakeholders in order to ensure a common approach. 3, holistic approach to understanding and managing landscapes. A holistic approach means that there should be a balanced understanding of the natural and cultural elements at the site, as well as social and economic practices. In both the UK Lake District and Southern Öland, a holistic approach means ensuring that all stakeholders and management groups accept the importance of integrating and respecting all types of heritage present at the site. Holistic management approaches vary from site to site to address different challenges and issues at site level. In the UK Lake District, for example, tourism has had a large impact on natural and cultural and economic factors since the 1800s, with local and international visitors partaking in the recreational, literary, and artistic attributes of the landscape. Pre-COVID, there were approximately 19.5 million annual visitors to the site, most of which were international tourists. With the pandemic, there has been an emphasis on local and national tourism, with stakeholders considering new ways of approaching different types of tourists. For example, some farmers have begun to set up campsites in unused fields for the large number of visitors, which can help create economic stability during the uncertain times. In Öland, there's a fairly balanced understanding of the importance of farmers for the cultural and natural heritage, but climate change has now become a huge issue for holistic management. The common threat towards heritage from rising sea levels, drought, and changing climate patterns is providing new opportunities for greater integration between nature and culture conservation agencies, which can holistically work together to find new solutions while continuing to use traditional practices. In our global view today, particularly in response to climate change and the resulting loss of biodiversity and cultural diversity, agricultural and pastoral landscapes are increasingly recognized as having common value and use for all people. While these ideas are not new, they address the increasing concern related to nature conservation, the relationship that exists between people and the environment, and the potentially unavoidable impacts on local, national, and international landscapes. To address this, it will require not only new ways of thinking, but old ways as well.
Hello and thank you. My name is Daryl Carey and I'm the Historic Buildings Program Manager for the City of Calgary. The conference theme, Heritage and the Global Reset, Seizing the Moment, is personally timely. Recently, the IPCC report, a discussion with an old friend who's a net zero building expert, and the smoky summer have reset my thinking on historic buildings. Today, I will touch on these topics: Calgary's Historic Buildings Program and our window sub-program, 4 completed window projects and the results, and how my thinking about all this has been reset. In 2011, Council approved the Historic Buildings Program to position Calgary as a leader in historic building stewardship. Since then, the city has taken a program-based, proactive approach to historic buildings. At its simplest, the program coordinates and bundles projects to achieve benefits and mandates high standards in the application of the standards and guidelines. The most important benefit is that it engenders collaboration. Consultants, contractors, authorities, and city staff have all worked together to learn and share knowledge. There's a wide range of buildings in the program. However, many are of the same vintage and employ similar materials, construction, and craft. The 4 projects I'm showing were built at a time when building technology changed very little. The first project to be completed was the 200 windows of City Hall. The sash were not original and had badly deteriorated. New double-glazed operable sash were installed using traditional materials and methods. Windows were tested post-installation for air and water infiltration. The next project to be completed was the Rouleau House. The windows had either been replaced or were too badly damaged to repair. They were replaced in kind using traditional methods and materials. These windows were not tested. The third project to be completed was the Holy Angels School. 100 original single-hung windows were restored based on what we learned from the previous projects. I'm going to focus on the windows at the YWCA, where 98 historic windows are currently being restored. The YWCA is a designated provincial historic resource. Its heritage value lies in its association with the establishment of the YWCA in Alberta and for its Georgian Revival architecture by architect David McElroy. This project was a chance to apply everything we had learned from the previous projects and to test and document the results. Testing was done on this project in the planning stage and again at the construction phase. A thorough as-found condition assessment was completed. From the pictures, you can see the nature of the condition: deferred maintenance, inappropriate repairs, wood rot, mechanical damage, overpainting, and inoperable sash. Note the plastic film to prevent drafts. Interventions included dismantling the window assembly, paint, glass, and putty removal, wood repairs including Dutchman, partial sash replacement and frame repair, repainting, and reinstalling of the sash, pulley, ropes, weights, weather stripping, and hardware. The restoration process was as environmentally friendly as possible. Steam boxes were used to remove the paint, and linseed oil putty was used to reglaze the windows, which were refinished with linseed oil paint. This photo shows a completed window assembly without the storm. This shows the storm window. There is no conclusive evidence that this building ever had storm windows. However, The frames were built to accept storm windows and would have been typical on a building like this. We decided to have new storms built and installed using typical materials and methods of the period. They are semi-permanent in that they can easily be removed and reinstalled if required. The city has standard testing and performance requirements on most construction projects that have been used in the historic building program. We've tested and analyzed sandstone, mortar, bricks, paint, and window assemblies to ensure value for money and acceptable performance and compatibility. We completed window mock-up assemblies on all of these projects. City Hall and the YWCA windows were tested in accordance with industry standards for air infiltration and water penetration. We used the NAFS CSA performance standards for operable windows. The air infiltration standard is a maximum of 0.5 liters per second per meter squared. The water penetration standard is no evidence of water penetration for the 5-minute test duration. Field testing standards were used to ensure consistency and accurately in the performance measurements. 6 windows at City Hall were tested for air and water infiltration. They clearly met the air leakage standard and passed the water penetration test. We were very pleased with the results. At the YWCA, infiltration was testing done on an as-found window assembly. No water infiltration was done at this stage. From this table, you can see that even a basic restoration significantly improves the performance. Without a storm, the window significantly exceeded the standard, and with a weather strip storm, the air infiltration performance is even better. The assembly failed the water infiltration test at 4 minutes 45 seconds when a drop of moisture made its way in. Given the law of diminishing returns, as project sponsor, I signed off. So, what has been reset? The greenest building is the one that is already built. I've used this quote many times and defended it mostly with the embodied energy argument. Now I realize that's not enough, and I've reset my thinking and would add, the greenest building is the one that is already built if it is net zero. Preserving embodied energy is not enough. The next phase of the YWCA project is a full base building and interior rehabilitation. We can significantly increase the energy performance, but we must get it to a truly net zero project. That is the challenge for all of us. Thank you.
My name is Robin Hoytema, and the title of my presentation is From Worship to Wellness, Reimagining Post-Pandemic Places of Worship in Ontario. This is an extension of my thesis research completed during my Master of Architecture Studies at Carleton University. Historic churches in Canada are in a time of crisis. The National Trust estimates that 1/3 of faith buildings will be forced to close before 2030, which translates to the loss of over 9,000 buildings. The heritage values of these unique spaces are well established in Ontario, and churches have come to represent not only a subset of religious ideologies, but also the collective memories of rural and urban communities across the province. With the rise of the COVID-19 pandemic, it has highlighted the pre-existing inequalities and resource gaps in Ontario's healthcare system. With the influx of temporary and permanent church closures, it seems that these buildings are currently underutilized, thus creating an opportunity to address healthcare concerns in Ontario. This topic questions how church architecture can reconnect with the church's original values of health and healing, while also generating a collection of new public health uses to support Ontario's healthcare system. So why historical churches? Southern Ontario has a high density of historical church buildings, which are facing increasing developmental pressures, rising costs, and aging congregations. With the temporary closures due to the COVID-19 pandemic, many churches fear that they will not be able to ever reopen. Unlike other provinces like Quebec, in Ontario, these buildings don't receive special funding and are often undesignated, leaving them vulnerable to demolition and incompatible alterations. Ultimately, the question of church conservation comes down to values. To better understand the unique values of historical churches in Ontario, I began mapping different municipalities to examine the character of churches in both rural and urban regions of the province. I then compiled this information into a survey, which I used to analyze the commonalities and adaptive reuse potential of this typology. The goal of adaptive reuse is to connect the original heritage values with a new use that exemplifies these values in a new way. Both churches and healthcare facilities share an inherently public use and function, an interest in spiritual and physical wellness, strong community connections, the provision of common good services, and an overall goal to help those in need. Based on this, I decided to pursue research into how historical churches in Ontario can be repurposed into healthcare facilities at this time where public health needs urgent support. To explore this further, I'll be discussing one of the case studies from my thesis research. Holy Trinity Anglican Church is a large stone Gothic revival church located in the rural town of North Gore, Ontario, which is about 30 minutes south of Ottawa. It was originally constructed in 1879 using local stone from surrounding farms after the land was deeded to the Anglican Diocese of Ontario. Some of the key character-defining elements are the bell tower, spire, symmetrical massing with regular stone buttresses, as well as the wooden roof, hammer beam trusses, and the detailed stained glass windows. Despite the strong architectural values of the space, this building has no official heritage designation, and the congregation has already been working with city employees to rezone and sell parts of the site to generate income for the shrinking community. I began researching the greater context to identify the needs of the community of North Gore. I quickly noticed that North Gore is near the center of the municipality, and the closest hospital is at least 30 minutes in any direction. After researching healthcare services which require patients to frequently visit hospitals for treatment, I came across the Dialysis Network of Ontario. This map shows the hospitals which offer dialysis in the vicinity of Ottawa and shows the gap for rural communities within the municipality. As of 2017, there were 938 dialysis patients in the city of Ottawa alone, and this number is due to increase almost 27% by 2027 in Ontario. Patients with chronic dialysis require treatment up to 3 times a week, with sessions taking upwards of 4 hours each. Despite the relatively small amount of equipment and the simplicity of the procedure, there are limited options for dialysis in a non-hospital environment in Ontario. This is especially problematic during health crises like the COVID-19 pandemic, because it forces immune-compromised dialysis patients to travel to hospitals where they may be infected with other serious illnesses. This is the current floor plan of Holy Trinity Anglican Church, and this drawing shows how the building could be reinterpreted as an 8-station dialysis clinic. A clinic of this size would serve approximately 40 dialysis patients in the Ottawa region. For the design, I prioritized conserving the verticality and interior massing of the sanctuary space and focused on working with the existing modularity of the structure by lining up the units with the buttresses. I also used half walls between the station with glass on the upper portion to avoid obscuring interior views, while also providing a sense of privacy for the patients. Lastly, I updated the sanctuary ramp from its original location on the side of the sanctuary to the center, which allows it to comply with modern building code requirements and also allows for 2 accessible washrooms to be added in the southwest corner. Based on my case studies, I generated a set of recommendations to continue exploring the possibilities of adaptive reuse for religious buildings in Ontario. These recommendations are for policymakers, conservation professionals, community groups, and any other relevant stakeholders who are interested in religious heritage in Ontario. So the first recommendation is to research and inventory all the historic churches in Ontario to understand the existing building stock and identify churches for potential designation. Second would be to conduct a survey of cities and towns in the municipality to identify unique community healthcare needs. Then third recommendation is to overlay these layers of information to start connecting historic churches with new healthcare uses. Then lastly, I would recommend to create a pilot project based on these case studies, which would display the potential of church buildings to solve targeted healthcare needs. That concludes the presentation. If anyone is interested in learning more, my full thesis is available through the Carleton University Thesis Collection website. And I hope that these ideas have inspired you to think beyond the traditional possibilities of adaptive reuse for historical churches. Thank you for listening.
Hi, I'm Shelley Ludman, an architect with ERA Architects, an architecture, heritage, and planning firm with offices in Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa. Today's presentation, titled Community-Led Consensus and Strategies for Investment, will focus on our recent work in Cremor, Ontario, where we engaged with the public to ultimately identify opportunities to amplify community-based work in the village. I'll walk you through the project's mandate and our process, culminating in a final report that was delivered to the client in May of this year. Before we jump into the specifics of our work, I want to give you a brief overview of Cremor, Ontario. Cremor was settled in 1842, is located about 130 kilometers north of Toronto, and sits on the eastern boundary of the Niagara Escarpment. It's a former village, now part of the Clearview Township, with a charming main street known as Mill Street, seen in the photo here, and vibrant small businesses. In 2016, it had a population of 1,170. Fast forward to 2020, where ERA was retained by the Cremor Community Foundation, a local group founded in 2018 to strengthen and enhance the culture, heritage, and beauty of Cremor. We were retained to develop a cultural economic plan for the community. The report, titled A Vision for Cremor, attempted to outline opportunities to best support community-led initiatives in the village through the development of a proposed action plan. The report was not just focused on conserving and amplifying the buildings along their main street, but on using their heritage resources to drive and support larger strategic objectives in the village. To support our work, the foundation assembled a steering committee made up of 8 community members, including the president of the local area residents association, the president of the Business Improvement Association, a local artist, residents, and local students. We worked closely with the steering committee and residents over a 7-month period. To ensure the report accurately captured the needs and opinions of the community, we facilitated a 3-part public engagement strategy, ultimately achieving 353 points of engagement. The engagement strategy included 4 roundtable discussions, 7 focused interviews, and an online and paper survey. We worked with an outside consultant to lead the sessions, ensuring that we remained unbiased and were able to review and analyze the data with fresh eyes. Given the timing of the consultation and COVID-19, all discussions were conducted online via Zoom. We tried to keep the groups small enough to encourage conversation and participation. The roundtable discussions were held with representatives of 4 distinct stakeholder groups: residents with ties to community and arts organizations, the local agricultural business owners, the Cremor Business Improvement Association, and young residents of Cremor and the surrounding area. We facilitated discussions on Cremor's village core, identity, heritage, arts and culture, agriculture, and opportunities for new initiatives, programming, and growth. We then conducted 7 direct interviews with key stakeholders. Participants included 4 elected officials, township staff, agricultural business owners, and key community organization leaders. Specific questions tailored to the background of each interviewee were developed, and conversations organically flowed around the intersection of Cremor's identity, culture, and future, and the interviewee's particular experience and point of view. Finally, we conducted a survey posted both online and in the local paper. The survey was intended to capture the largest audience possible. It included roughly 30 questions and was centered around 5 key sections: about you, Cremor's character, Mill Street and the surrounding area today, Mill Street and the vision for the future, and then the wider community and its vision for the future. The survey results were fascinating and widespread, and I could likely spend a whole 7 minutes just talking about them. But in the interest of time, I've pulled a slide from one of our steering committee workshops to share with you. Once we had collected all the survey information, we tried to find ways to graphically relay what we had heard to start synthesizing all the information. As you can see on the screen, there were 2 key themes underlying a series of questions: Mill Street and economic drivers beyond Mill Street. The responses naturally lent themselves to 2 distinct categories: what is working well, everything above the pink line, and what is needed to strengthen and grow, everything below the pink line. Following a series of exercises similar to the one I just shared, 5 key topics emerged: character, identity, and heritage, arts and culture, recreation and engagement, business community, and planning and development. The topics were intended to be broad, largely to help organize a range of related ideas. Objective statements were then developed for each topic in an attempt to capture some of the background and rationale for the development of that topic. 3 strategies were developed for each topic, and each strategy was further broken down into a series of recommended actions. The proposed action plan is intended to serve as a jumping off point for community members to engage in conversations, forge partnerships, and chart out next steps in response to identified opportunities and challenges. The Foundation has not yet had the opportunity to present the final report to the community due to COVID-19, and as such, I won't be sharing the final takeaways with you today. I did, however, want to walk you through an example to better relay how the report was intended to function. The map on the left notes all 15 strategies. We overlaid all 15 onto one map of Cremor to graphically depict the extent of their impact, i.e. Mill Street versus the wider community versus the broader township. The example on the right notes the proposed 3 strategies for the topic of character, identity, and heritage. 1, to protect Mill Street buildings, 2, to develop a cohesive streetscape plan, and 3, to improve wayfinding and signage. Within the report, we build out details on the proposed actions for each potential strategy, including relevant example projects and other helpful resources. Today's brief presentation was intended to outline the engagement process and lessons learned while helping a local community develop a vision for their future. We learned that when there's a clearly defined collective goal, different individuals and organizations can come together collaboratively and effectively. We learned that to fuel a project of this nature, having a clearly defined organizing body and diversity and representation is key. And finally, that all the proposed actions are specific to this community and that no idea is too small. Hopefully, today's presentation about community-led consensus and strategies for investment encourages other individuals to start thinking about how heritage assets can be one lever in the development or growth of cultural economies, and that projects of this nature have the potential to ignite excitement, creativity, and conversations from local residents. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today about Heritage Inspires YYC. We are volunteers who advocate to preserve heritage districts and promote the productive use of buildings of historic significance in Calgary. Just like the name says, this is a campaign to inspire Calgarians to think about heritage as we create policy to build a city for the future. I'm Karen and will lead off with an overview of the campaign and how it was designed to reach a new audience of heritage advocates. Stakeholder and volunteer audiences were also reached. Tara will follow with a discussion of the role of one of our stakeholder groups, the real estate industry. I'd also like to acknowledge Lorna Cordero for her contributions. She's co-founder of Calgarians for Heritage Districts. Launched in February of 2021, this campaign aims to raise awareness of Calgary's heritage resources and distinctive character areas that date from the late 19th century to the mid-20th century. We saw a gap in public awareness of our heritage resources and new city policies to redevelop our inner city communities through a local area planning process. Higher densities are sought to curb sprawl, make for a more sustainable city, and provide more diverse and inclusive housing, often at the expense of heritage resources and neighborhood character. Our target audience for this campaign was millennials, those who may not yet see themselves as heritage advocates. They may aspire to live in a heritage community, work in a historic building, or frequent local businesses in older character communities. They care about authenticity, climate resiliency, economic sustainability, and quality of life. We used targeted social media, appealing graphics, color theory, humor, and positive messaging to reach the millennial audience.
Let's tag those bricks.
That's not cool, Grandma.
This engaging video linked to the Heritage Inspires YYC website with 4 template letters about specific heritage issues. These letters could be customized by members of the public to submit letters to city councillors in advance of a public hearing on controversial new planning policy to redevelop mature communities. The comprehensive website also offers examples of heritage destinations for local tourism, businesses and services occupying 50+ repurposed buildings, 36 community histories and walking tours, 17 flyover videos of potential heritage districts, and 8 homeowner designation stories. We attracted a huge volunteer response to execute the campaign, well beyond what we set out to do. 60+ volunteers contributed everything from website development, drone videos, photography, social media administration, and writing community histories. Over the next 2 years, the video, website, and social media accounts will be applied to these other campaigns listed here. Notably, the campaign can be adapted to other municipalities simply by swapping out the YYC with another city's identifier. I will turn it over to Tara now to give you an overview of the Realtor audience.
Thank you. My name is Tara, and I'm also on the board of directors for Calgary Heritage Initiative. The Heritage Inspires YYC campaign was made possible through a grant awarded by the Alberta Real Estate Foundation. Why would realtors want to support heritage? A letter written by the president of Calgary's Real Estate Board articulated the desire to support a diversity in housing stock, because realtors benefit from marketing differentiated products that respond to the values and needs of their clients, bylaws and policies that ensure the stability of neighborhood character. They also support the creation of heritage districts, knowing that protected heritage districts can see an uplift in property values. Information that we provided to realtors through this campaign include a special tab on the website for Heritage Inspires YYC with materials such as the windshield survey, identifying heritage properties in Calgary, information about the impact of designation and heritage districts for real estate values, community histories with photos and walking tours to help sell these areas. We also have many FAQs and a glossary of terms on the website that received great feedback from realtors. Training was offered in the form of webinars to realtors registered with the Calgary Real Estate Board, otherwise known as CREB. Topics included new heritage area policies, how to market heritage properties, and these trainings will continue through the fall and winter months. An article about the campaign appeared in CREB's magazine newsletter, and the campaign was also featured in a blog published by the Alberta Real Estate Foundation, which can be accessed by realtors throughout the province. We will continue to partner with realtors as we work to shift the paradigm from tear down to repurposing heritage properties, supporting the designation of heritage properties, dispelling myths about designation, advocating for new heritage area policies and potential heritage districts by recognizing the economic uplift that heritage can bring, educating and influencing real estate buyers about the benefits of heritage conservation for urban economic recovery, sustainability, and livability. Thank you, and we'll look forward to answering your questions.
What a fascinating group of presentations, and Heritage YYC, I'm going to have lots of questions for them afterwards, and the others. Wanted to circle back. I committed one of the cardinal sins of moderation when I didn't even introduce myself off the top of the hour. I'm Chris Wiebe, and I'm the conference coordinator at the National Trust for Canada, and among other things there. So my apologies around that. Actually, why am I here? Well, Camille was slated to be here and be your moderator. She's a project architect at CSV Architects in Ottawa. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here today due to a family emergency. So you have me, and I'm butterfingers with my moderation. But in that vein, this is a more informal session. So in that vein, we're going to throw it over to Nancy Oakley, who's going to be actually giving us another presentation here, a live presentation. And it's entitled Capital Conversions, New Ideas to Support Old Places. And Nancy is a heritage consultant at Heritage Connects. And I believe you're in Hamilton, right, Nancy? And I'm going to throw it over to you.
All right, thanks so much, Chris. I'm really appreciating the kind of looseness of this style of presentation. I'm Eastern Ontario, let's put it that way. Both wonderful places to be. But I'm going to, if you can bear with me for a second here, I'm just going to share my screen, and through the magic of technology, hopefully this connects and you guys can see what I have here. And I'll start my slideshow, and I suppose without further ado, I will get right into it. I do want to thank Chris, the National Trust, and all the other presenters for the really evocative ideas that they've presented here today. I'm sure lots of sparks are being generated even as we speak. So getting into it, my hope for this presentation is that we might reconsider our historic main streets and their value for communities, for the economy, and for the environment. And I've packed a 3-hour lecture into just 7 minutes, so I hope you'll pardon the brevity. This presentation is based on emerging thinking about values-based management and the relationship between economic and heritage values. And for historians and planners, it's a bit like learning a new language. So if you'll indulge me, I'll take us through some of the ABCs. This review asked a couple of interconnected questions. Why are historic main streets important today? And why or how should they be conserved? And to answer these questions, Heritage Connects considered 3 general concepts that framed our study: the sense of place and the evolving character of each street, the regulatory regime for conservation, and how each street is adapting to the challenges and opportunities of today to meet their needs. So main streets are a distinctive historic place in North America. As commercial and civic places of exchange for over 150 years, Canada's main streets are similar in function to the United Kingdom's high streets and to France's rue principes, yet distinctive in their historic environment. We looked at 3 towns, Cobourg, Belleville, and Picton in Ontario, and each of these has been a place that has demonstrated an ongoing commitment to conservation and the success of conservation efforts in response to economic upturns and downswings over 5 generations. All established in the early 19th century during prominent periods of development following the Treaty of Ghent in 1814 and the Upper Canada Rebellion in 1837. Each is a focal point for their local communities within their respective cities and regions. They share similar architectural styles, historical, commercial, constructed of brick or stone that reflect elements of classicism. These evolving cultural landscapes have seen a significant evolution in their built fabric since the 1970s, as well as more contemporary infill. This diversity of style, together with efforts to nurture the natural heritage of the streetscapes, keeps things interesting. Both Cobourg and Picton have conservation systems that include bylaws for the protection of heritage places, grants for conservation activities, and planning and design guidelines for new infill. While Belleville does have a conservation system in place, interestingly, none of the buildings along its main street are designated under these bylaws. Other processes that contribute to the conservation of these evolving cultural landscapes include cultural tourism and city beautification initiatives. In the past 3 years, All three have demonstrated a resiliency in the face of uncertain economic conditions. This is observed in vacancy rates, new businesses, and construction projects. At the same time of the study, Belleville had more vacant storefronts, yet also more new businesses and renovation and construction projects underway. Comparably, Picton, which has made significant investments in urban design, had no vacancies and one major restoration project underway. Cobourg had about half as many vacancies and businesses as Belleville. So who's moving to Main Street? New businesses have included cannabis dispensaries, family-run businesses under new meat ownership, a diverse culinary scene, and media companies. These have been augmented by nonprofit organizations that provide social services, community spaces, and contribute to the streetscape beautification. Even as we continue to appreciate historic main streets for their connections to the past, we can consider how they might be valued in our contemporary context. New forms of commercial consumption patterns, such as the malls and suburbia of the 20th century post-war period, and now online services, have challenged the vitality of main streets. There's hope that recent efforts around digital main streets might use these new commercial exchanges to sustain activity in these places. While it's true that more people are buying online, it's also true that people like to see what they're purchasing, enjoy shopping experiences, want to support local and family-owned businesses, enjoy shopping experiences, and want to participate in placemaking in their communities. These are not things that can be done online. The digital main streets and the other big tech technology like immersive media also raise very important questions about the future of main streets, which are more than investment vehicles, quaint scenery, or throwbacks to the past. They're places which work best when they are lived in person and in together. Research and experience demonstrate that market-based approaches don't account for historic places. As we consider development as a conservation activity, we might begin to define this relationship. We might consider main streets as places that permit the conversions and convergences of capital. What is meant by this? Consider the design values of Canadian Gothic architecture represent at some level an exchange between the economic, money, and cultural values. The granite that's shaped into carved trefoils and the craftsmen who created them, and which have accrued over time. Compared to more modern exchanges, these capital concentrations are characterized as dense, character building, and significant both locally and globally. Any economic value assigned to these through market, whether as architectural salvage or the most photographed element of a famous building, cannot capture the full value of the tangible and intangible heritage that has been created and which has endured the test of time in situ. It can only ever be an approximation. Given this value, capital exchanges that take place within our historic environments would fundamentally be structured on sustaining that process between the tangible and the intangible. What historic main streets appear to do simply, more contemporary design seeks to replicate to varying forms of degree or success. Former ACO President Kathy Naismith identified the real history of what happens to main streets when their historic values are overlooked. Historic environments become facades, facades are deconstructed into urban design pastiche. What is left? Robert Alsop has warned against the beautiful atrophy of urban taxidermy and stuffed buildings that have no real social or economic purpose in their city, the kinds of places that may be technically accurate in their conservation or design, but which miss the bigger point about the relationship between the built environment and culture. Underlying both these comments is the need to prioritize culture and community, the very things which sustain the life and vitality of place. The money always follows. What that money does is important. The temptation posed by financial capital to value precious things and in doing so commodify them on the path to pastiche is real. Foreign investment might consider main streets as secure places to invest, and rightly so. The impact of this investment, however, might not come at the expense of the very values which have made it so compelling a vehicle in the first place. There are elements of society and economy which remain outside of development. Exchanging long-term, locally owned businesses for pop-up shops doesn't necessarily result in the kinds of exchanges that contribute to the historic environment, but may expose them to new risks. A new kind of cultural economic framework is needed that is rooted in an understanding of historic places and which considers the hard questions of elements like design, materials, craftsmanship, tradition, and spirit that define the integrity of place. The role of the public sector, private interest, and nonprofit sectors may diverge or even compete, but time has proven that successful initiatives are those which reject the law of diminishing returns and which appreciate the value of historic environments and share objectives of their conservation and continuance. I want to leave you with one last consideration. Most revitalization strategies for main streets focus on commercial activity as the crucible for success. Recent strategies have also considered well-being and quality of life as important measures. To complete the circle, we might posit that the civic function of main streets is the missing ingredient. The free and considered exchange of ideas and perspectives that help shape and build communities, which develop the social and cultural capital that make these places still good places to live, work, and play. In closing, to answer Mark Carney's question posed during a CBC Ideas episode recently, only a short while ago, whether the future of our global relations takes the shape of a market society or a market economy, I have to ask, why not both? Thank you et merci.
Thanks so much, Nancy. Wow, scampering through 3 hours in 7 minutes, a tour de force experience. That was great. We'll have to come back to you with some questions.
Looking forward to it.
That's great. Back to the beginning of things, and we've got a lot of really good meaty questions in the chat here from our attendees, our faithful attendees. I want to whiz right back to Hunter Cardinal and his fascinating presentation right off the bat. And I want to go right for the jugular here. And I guess one of your questions, you said one of the most powerful questions is about weaving layers. I think we talk a lot about layers in place. A lot of people that are involved with Little Bank will know about the whole kind of layer. I guess things like, would you be able to unpack an example or two of how have you seen that successfully done, that weaving of layers? I'm thinking about your new project at Rossdale Power Plant in Edmonton or others, but could you just unpack that a bit more about that kind of a vision?
Absolutely. I think a way that we can unpack it is actually by diving into the very exciting conversations around ethical space, which I think we may be all peripherally aware of. But for those who aren't, ethical space is a term that is kind of connected to that idea of safe spaces. And it's a concept that was originally furthered during the meeting of Western and Indigenous knowledges. And when I say knowledges there, I think that's really critical to understand that these systems of relating to the world that people have, of relating to systems of political, social, scientific, and cultural systems are separate and distinct from one another, which I think is really critical to recognizing that there are differences from ourselves and other people in terms of how they interact with the world. So what's helpful, and I swear I am circling back to your question there, Chris. What's helpful is looking at ethical space in a way that Dr. Ermine points out, which is an inner space as well as a physical space. So an inner space is basically an individual opportunity to pause and reflect, to recognize the presence of the other without stating it. So it's a moment of quiet reflexivity where you recognize that you are not the same as perhaps the individual that you're speaking with. And recognizing that we are not the same. We are connected, but of course we may have different ways of looking at the world based off of our worldviews. And then we can have a physical space where that is basically what are the tangibles, the things in the environment in terms of design considerations that allow us to support individuals going into that physical space and that inner space as well. So in terms of how I've seen this most effectively done would be around the consultations recently that we did for a project, the Aurora expansion from the TELUS World of Science. They were concerned with how do they, when they're expanding their grounds, make space for Indigenous ideas and peoples in a welcoming way. So we conducted a series of engagements with a whole wide variety of wonderful Indigenous thought leaders. And what we found was really interesting was those necessary design considerations and active programming that allowed both Indigenous peoples to feel like their specific worldviews and all of the different knowledge systems that are connected with that were represented in an authentic and responsible way, whereas providing those folks that are attending who happen to be non-Indigenous the opportunity to have really rich post-liminal experience their assumptions that they may be walking around with the world. And it's not necessarily to shame people to be like, oh, you're doing it wrong, but it's just to once again provide that physical space and the opportunity to dive into that inner space. So that is how I would answer that question. And I hope I made sense.
No, that was great. And that's a fascinating place because the TELUS World of Science, Douglas Cardinal was the architect. And also actually one of the, like the planetarium on that site of 1950s, 60s one was actually recently won an award and will be talked about National Trust Award Winners Circle a couple of days from now. But I mean, a very kind of originally kind of very Western kind of oriented kind of design in that landscape, and to bring out that kind of Indigenous layers, super important. Okay, thanks, Hunter. Just jumping over to Sarah Campbell, I'm going to pounce on KLG has a great question there. What is your, in terms of thinking about, put you on the spot here, what is your thoughts on that, or really a monument? And obviously a deeply challenging space. And its history is so fascinating. What was it, erected in 1920s? Like it was post First World War. What would you see? What would you see in terms of the future of that site? Would you care to speculate on the possibilities there?
Well, and I guess I'd like to be clear that we're speaking specifically about this monument because I really think that problematic monuments, they're just so, every single monument needs to be looked at differently in terms of its own context and its own, in the historic intent behind it and all that. So specifically for this monument, personally, I would really like to see it. I mean, it is removed, and I don't think there's any place where it should be put back into in terms of a public space or civic space, because I just I don't see how its original intent can be erased, and I really believe in this case that artistic value can't trump the social justice or the greater good of racial equity. So I think that's for this context. And I know that there was actually a Champlain Monument working group, and they had a lot of meetings with the community, and they published a full report in 2019. And their conclusion their recommendation was to replace only the portion of Champlain and leave out the problem. Canada has decided to completely suspend reinstallation, and I think that's until further consultation with groups. And I think that's the right decision, because I just a statue of Champlain in and of itself isn't necessarily offensive, but this specific statue of Champlain, even on its own, it doesn't negate the original intent of the monument. But in terms of its future, I'm not sure. I guess there's a few options. It could be relocated, recontextualized, and I think again that's a decision that would have to be reached through community consensus.
It's really interesting, and I mean that was should have stepped back even a little bit further, because I think like the whole monuments discussion is a really fascinating one. It shows the limits of certain kinds of doctrinal or theoretical documents and being able to like bring it to textual, and that's one of the challenges around the social media handling of it in a lot of cases, that it just makes this kind of values involved in those places. So
And I think it's also in preservation and conservation movements where we often are really focused on the materiality of an object or a building, it's about time we acknowledge that actually our position, whether we want to be or not, it is political. We really can influence the way public can perceive space. So we just need to be aware of that and be sensitive. Just any project we approach, really strive to understand its history, make decisions based on community consensus, and yeah.
Okay, maybe we can circle back if we have some time to unpack a few more things there. I wanted to jump on to Leanna at Wigboldus and about those cultural landscapes you were talking about, because I mean, I think that is really interesting, because what you're really exploring there is some of the challenges of the stakeholders and the various stakeholders in places, again, layers of different value that have been on places, and who gets heard and how does that get integrated into management. Is all of this being kind of accelerated and accentuated, like the climate change issues that are happening in Uland and some of these other places, maybe the tourism pressures of the Lake Districts, of the Lake District in England? I mean, are there accelerants that are sort of making it even more challenging?
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of the issues that stakeholders come across when trying to work together is that there are so many different layers, as you said. And in the Lake District, they've actually, because it's such a new World Heritage Site, it's only 3 years old now, they've had a chance to sort of start fresh and take a look at other areas around the world that have ownership plans and management plans, and they were able to get a very general overview of many other sites and cultural landscapes which have used management in the past, and sort of focus it down into what could be the most useful way forward. And I think they've done a great job in the sense that this partnership plan, it's a partnership group. They meet 4 times a year when COVID's not in the way, and they are able to discuss these issues. I actually was able to visit the site in early March, very early March, once before things closed down. And it was fascinating to see all of the subcommittees and subgroups that came out of these 25 different managers and how they work together, and different ways forward for transportation, for tourism, for sustainable buildings in the area. A large issue they have is parking. For example, it's all the cars that come from day visitors and people who aren't staying for longer than a night. And how do you use buses or systems of transport to capitalize on the different tourists that you have? So yes, tourism, and especially climate change, because it's become so prevalent in many sites, I think it's really pushing people, as managers and stakeholders, to come up with new ways of looking at how to manage these large areas, because they're not one building, they're not one monument, they are huge areas of land that cover many acres. So it really is about finding a way to move forward, and the Lake District has done a great job of that.
It'll be interesting to see whether it'll go back to the old normal post-COVID in those places that were previously experiencing such pressures, and so we'll have to see what happens there. Just scampering over, just looking at the time here, scampering over to Daryl and your windows discussion. Boy, people are really seizing on the economics, and people say, "Okay, show me the money. Tell me about the money." In the chat here, it's like, wow, people are fixated. So why don't we go there? I guess in terms of the trying to convince 98 windows, rather than doing Dutchman and doing things down to very kind of very fine detail in terms of replacements of eroded wooden elements. I mean, what was it like convincing people? And in terms of policymakers and the powers that be, what was it? How did it, in terms of the cost benefit? How did that work out in financial terms, or are those too crude?
Thanks for that, Chris. I've seen the questions in the chat here. So right from the very beginning, when Calgary Council passed the citywide heritage management policy, we had aspirations to set an example. In our historic building program strategy is a specific principle where we're mandated to set a good example, which means apply the standards and guidelines as they are intended to be applied. With City Hall project, the bar was set really high. That was sort of the gold medal standard. The other projects, as budgets get tighter and tighter, I would say they're bronze level standards. I'm just working on a more detailed presentation on the windows at the YWCA, and I've started to do some math in my head. So to restore those window assemblies, each window with including the storms, was about $5,000. That's after 100 years with minimal maintenance on those buildings. And when I think about it, over 100 years, if we had replaced those windows with vinyl windows, it still would have cost probably $2,500 a window, but we would have done that 5 times and all of that material would have gone to the landfill. So I think I can make a case that it does make economic sense, as well as heritage conservation and environmental sense, to maintain and restore these windows rather than throwing them away. There's another question here about the cost to do the testing. So the city tests everything that we build. So to transfer that process to Heritage Buildings process, nobody ever questioned that. Off the top of my head, to set up the scaffolding, to do the water and air infiltration testing at the YWCA, probably I would say $5,000 maybe, but we've got really good data now that we can use going forward. And just as an aside, in the historic building program, one of our consultants, because of the need to do these testing on historic buildings, they went out and bought the testing equipment. So that's now, so we don't have to sub out to a testing company to do it, which again has helped manage costs. So that's a sort of off the top of my head response.
Well, that's fascinating. And I guess, when you factor in, when you leaven in things like life cycle analysis, the kind of the pure kind of dollar for dollar kind of comparison falls down. And I think you're going to be seeing that coming into public policy now in a more kind of aggressive way. Robin, I want to ask you, Robin Hoytema, I want to ask you about those churches. And it's so interesting because so often the go-to response with an empty church is to make it into a cultural center, or if you're in a larger city, make it into condos or do something kind of intensely retrofitting. This sounds like a really interesting approach in smaller centers. And are there some examples where they've actually operationalized this model? I would want to ask you, and maybe we could tack on that question about the costs, whether the costs of retrofitting versus purpose building sites for these kinds of medical kind of medical services in those kind of areas, whether you've had a chance to explore that or if you have some inklings about that.
Yeah, for sure. So as part of my research, I definitely looked into precedents. And even in Ontario, there are places where these historic churches have been bought and renovated into things like eyeglass clinics or smaller healthcare centers. So to me, it's similar to the idea of having like a community center, but it more different areas across the province. And then as well, like going back to what Daryl was saying about the cost to implement something like this, I think one of the issues that a lot of these church renovation projects encounter is that they are public buildings when they function as churches. So they do have certain tax benefits. And as soon as you're selling it to a private buyer, then some of those benefits. So when I was looking at the problem of church closure, I was really interested in trying to find a way where the public function of these buildings could still be maintained, not only for financial reasons, but also because they are such integral community buildings for a lot of the small communities in Ontario. And then in terms of trying to make it something practical, because I feel like when you first start to think about it, it doesn't necessarily seem like something that would jive, having a healthcare use in these historic buildings. So I really tried to look at functions that could work within these types of churches. So something obviously like an operating room is not something that's going to be feasible, but something like a women's healthcare center is, it doesn't have those same sort of like sanitary requirements or intense protocols that a lot of the other buildings have. So yeah, that's definitely the kind of approach that I've looked at to make something like this more feasible. And yeah, I hope that answers the question.
That's great. And I think we're seeing with hospitals and other kind of medical institutions, you want to have places that are uplifting and beautiful spaces to be in if you're having dialysis. Anyway, you're seeing this with hospitals, etc. So I think there's lots of fascinating things to explore there. We're wanting to look at the time here. I just want to quickly then go to Shelley. Shelley, there's a couple of questions here. I think your mapping objectives onto Cremor is brilliant. I don't know whether I've seen that too often, but I wanted to ask you around the engagement strategy. And I guess so often engagement strategies end up going to certain people or certain louder people in the community. Is that what you're trying, like in terms of trying to get a true sense of what is happening in that community? Is that why you had that detailed and layered kind of response to unpacking the possibilities and the other things that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Chris. And I'll try to be quick so we can get to a few others before we wrap at 5:30. But in our experience with engagement, everybody has a different sort of approach to how they respond. Some people prefer kind of being in a public setting and being those loud vocal folks that you were just referring to. Others are much happier to sort of on their own time kind of write something up and provide that in a more private setting. And so we really tried to make sure that we were catering to the various voices that might exist within the community. And especially because of COVID and because we couldn't do this in person, the access to technology was a really big piece too, and ensuring that if somebody didn't have a good internet connection or wasn't comfortable on Zoom, that they could go pick up a printed survey in one of the local stores and fill that out the same way someone was able to do that online via URL. So yeah, I think your notion of layering the different feedback was really important, and really just trying to make sure that every voice in the community was heard.
That's really interesting. It often ends up tall poppy situation where people are very vocal about that. And the mapping, anyway, I'd love to ask you about that. But a great project. I'd like to also ask Heritage YYC a little question there around, Alberta, having grown up there, I know that it's resistant to designation and government intervention of various kinds. I mean, is part of the approach with Heritage YYC, Heritage Inspires YYC, to try to shift those that kind of mindset in a softer way, rather than coming out with the kind of the legislative approach. And the approach to realtors is a fascinating one because they're real influencers. How did you settle on targeting on those kind of the approach and that kind of target?
I'll jump in, and Tara can add into us. So from a targeting perspective, I guess we're looking at that generation that's coming up that is purchasing homes, that is working in heritage buildings, that experiences the shops and retail and services end of things in heritage buildings, and to try to create that awareness and appreciation and value of the benefits, I guess, environmental, economic, social benefits of heritage. We knew that market was looking for an authentic experience, and we've heard that in some of the other threads today, particularly the Main Streets one, I thought was excellent there. So the end game here is to encourage designation and to encourage the idea of perhaps purchasing an older house and not getting kind of caught into the lot value marketing approach that some of the realtors had been pushing. So to bring in that younger audience and get them thinking about what it means to own a heritage house, the sustainability benefits of it, and so forth. So it was really that new audience, and also to put a fresh face in front of City Council when they're making decisions. Because frankly, my generation is not who we're building the city for the future. It's the next generation.
Good. Okay, I'll add on. And to pick up from where you left from your question, Chris, where you were saying, you know, it feels like this is a different approach. Definitely, I want to echo that was definitely by design, rather than being reactive to the teardown of heritage. And for those of you who saw the video, that was the motif that showed up in the video. We want to stop the teardown of heritage, but we kind of turned that on its axis and played with all the opportunities that heritage brings to a visioning exercise for building a future Calgary for, of course, the younger generations. So all the benefits that heritage can bring, and helping people to recognize what they already love about heritage. When they walk down the streets, when they visit older neighborhoods, whether it's commercial or residential. We had all kinds of examples of places that people visit, and then they get to appreciate, you know, what makes them different and unique. So just to jump over to the realtors, because there was at that time a visioning exercise going on in Calgary, they were coming up with new policies for local area planning, shifting the focus from communities to districts, and creating these larger collective area plans with multiple communities within them. They were adopting new heritage policies, and we took advantage of a grant program with the Alberta Real Estate Foundation and pitched it to them that this could be of interest to realtors, that they would want to know about these new heritage policies affecting residential streetscapes. We offered webinars and training, and then the website became a platform with a tab for realtors to find out more about heritage districts, the policies themselves, including designation. They really appreciated the glossary of terms that we had on the website, because it translated urban planning into real estate markets and their language, and they could understand what the relationship is between heritage and real estate, and why their customers would value this, and how they can market heritage properties to that audience. So it was a great relationship, a great partnership. I hope that we'll be doing more projects with realtors. And yeah, it's great to be looking for new stakeholder groups and new advocates to work with.
Thanks, Tara. Thanks, Karen. I guess we have a couple of minutes left here, and I just want to throw a question quickly out to Nancy. And I'm just wondering about whether, you know, just the kids come up in the Canada or the Canadian Urban Institute and their kind of exploration of the revitalization of main streets, and about the residential, above floor residential. And I'm wondering if that was figuring in terms of some of the considerations you were looking at too, and exploring with Picton and Cobourg and Belleville, in terms of, you know, creating affordable housing and that kind of getting people on the street and activating. Oftentimes the upper floor of those commercial buildings are empty, and they could be serving another purpose. Is that another part of the puzzle for main streets and their vitality?
You hit the nail on the head. Absolutely. The CUI, the Canadian Urban Institute, recently put out, I don't know if you guys have seen it, this really great playbook that basically cast a wide net to folks interested in this question of revitalizing main streets and said, well, what can we do here? And what came back were a number of really wonderful, I guess you could call them plug and play at varying degrees of budgets, of ways to animate historic places. I would have really liked to have seen more projects that considered the historic fabric of these places. That was kind of missing in that futuristic kind of looking, which is why I've put out this challenge of a call to contextualize this within the historic environment of these streets, because we know how easy it is to lose these things. We've been fighting that tension for quite a long time now. But to your point, we often talk about that commercial activity as being that first floor, because that's where most of the action happens. That's where most of the community and economic activity takes place. It is unfortunate because it seems if I were an investor, if I knew that I had a two-story, investment property, and I knew that, I could get somebody to run a business in the first floor, but knowing that that second floor was vacant, it's another opportunity there. And if there are X number of units that are there, they have been converted already. Ideally, maybe they're even historic places themselves, right? The historic interiors, a lot of these places remain unchanged over time, which represent really wonderful places for people to be able to live, work, and play, which is the way these historic environments used to be. And then that got separated out in kind of the post-war period, and now we're kind of returning to our senses. I would say, I'm not going to wade into rent issues or things like that, but to say that the historic main streets, fundamentally, they have that commercial function, they have that civic function, but like you said, they have that residential function as well. And so getting more people on the street, as Jane Jacob knows, makes livable, workable, safe kinds of vibrant places that continue to attract the right kinds of investment. So I don't know if that answered the question, but I would say there's absolutely nothing lost and everything to be gained by exploring that as an opportunity for affordable housing, working with what's already existing.
No, that's great. And I guess I could ask so many more questions around legacy businesses and supporting that. But anyway, we'll get that'll have to wait another time. That's the problem with these Spark sessions, is it's an embarrassment of riches. It's hard to know where to go off in which direction, but it's part of the beauty of it as well. I want to thank all of our presenters today for their stimulating and wide-ranging presentations. I also want to thank the sponsor of this session, Robertson Martin Architects, for their generous support in helping make this conference happen. I also want to draw your attention to tonight. There's going to be something called, it used to be called an evening mixer. I thought it sounded a little too old school. And so we renamed it Beverages and Breakout Rooms. Start your conference off with a social bang. So we'll see how frisky that gets. We have some people lined up to have some really interesting kind of breakout spaces. So find a beverage of your choice and bring it tonight. It's happening at 7 p.m. Eastern time. Could be different in your time zone, of course, but it's just for an hour, but it's a nice way to connect with people and start the networking dimensions of the conference. But thanks so much to all of our presenters again, and hope to see you at other sessions throughout the conference. Have a good night, everyone.